Hi everyone. So we're going to be going over chapter 3, which is titled Water and Life. And basically, life as we know it started over 3 billion years ago inside of water, before it started to colonize land. And water is referred to as Earth's biological medium because it's a substance that makes life possible. And today, 3/4 of Earth's surface is covered by water, and all terrestrial organisms remain closely connected to it. And this is because most cells are surrounded by water. Cells themselves are composed of 70 to 95% water. Water serves as a necessary reactant in many of the chemical reactions that are essential to life. And water is also unique as a common substance because it is the only commonly found substance in all three physical states: liquid, solid, and gas. So to start this chapter, we need to have a strong understanding of covalent bonds because they are the bonds that hold together our water molecules. So in chapter 2, we defined a covalent bond as a bond that occurs when there is a sharing of electrons between atoms. And we also learned that there are two kinds of covalent bonds. We have nonpolar and we have polar covalent bonds. And in a nonpolar covalent bond, we have an equal sharing of electrons. And we have no charges in our molecule. However, in our polar bonds, we have unequal electron sharing. And we do have partial charges. So we can think of a covalent bond kind of like two people holding hands. When we have people holding hands, they are just staying close together. And the same way that they stay close together is the way that atoms sharing their electrons are staying close together. And when we have a nonpolar covalent bond, the people holding hands are equally as strong and neither of them is pulling harder than the other. But in a polar covalent bond, one person is stronger than the other, and the stronger person pulls that weaker person's hand closer, which causes a slight imbalance between them. So when we apply these concepts to water, we see that water is a polar molecule with polar covalent bonds. And this is because in our water molecule, oxygen is more electronegative. It is stronger than hydrogen. So oxygen is going to pull these shared electrons closer. So here we have our oxygen and our hydrogens. Our oxygen is more electronegative, and it is going to have a negative partial charge, which is denoted like this. And our hydrogen atoms, they're going to be less electronegative and have a positive partial charge. So you guys remember that in an atom, we have 3 subatomic particles, and the 3 subatomic particles are protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons and neutrons are both found in the nucleus, and protons have a positive charge, meanwhile neutrons have no charge. So the nucleus of an atom is always going to be positively charged. And then we have our electrons, and our electrons are found in our cloud, and electrons have a negative charge. So our electron cloud is always going to be negatively charged. So what happens when we have oxygen pulling the shared electrons between hydrogen and itself closer to oxygen is that it's going to develop a partially negative charge because now there's a disbalance of the ratio of protons to electrons. So now we have more electrons than we had protons, and it has a negative charge. And because these electrons are now further away from hydrogen, hydrogens are actually going to have a partially positive charge because the ratio of electrons to protons now is that there are more protons than electrons. So when we look at our water molecule, we see that its shape is sort of like a wide V, and we have our oxygen at the top with our two hydrogens at the bottom. And when we have a separation of atoms with a difference in charges, like we have here our partial negative charge and our partial positive charge, we get something called a dipole moment, also called a net dipole. And all of this dipole moment is referring to is a difference in charges at opposite ends of the molecule. So this space that we have here between our oxygen and our hydrogen, it is a space that is created because of our partial negative and partial positive charges. And it's called a net dipole or a dipole moment. So the first section of this chapter is called Polar Covalent Bonds in Water Molecules Result in Hydrogen Bonding. So we know that our water molecule is made up of oxygen and hydrogen, with hydrogen being less electronegative than oxygen, which causes the oxygen to pull the electrons closer to it, which is why oxygen has this partial negative charge and hydrogen has a partial positive charge. So this bent shape that water has is actually very telling, and it reinforces the polarity of water. And this is because when we see a molecule that has covalent bonds and it has a bent or asymmetrical shape with partial charges, it's likely to be polar because this asymmetrical shape prevents the partial charges from canceling out, which results in our dipole moment. And this shape just makes sure that these two charges don't cancel out, and it reinforces its molecular polarity. And this polarity is what helps water interact with other molecules in really important ways, such as dissolving salts or being the reason that we have really high surface tension. I also wanted to mention that covalent bonds are intramolecular forces, which is what we see here. We see our bond between two different atoms, which is an intramolecular bond. So now that we've gone over water and its polarity, I just wanted to talk about why its polarity allows it to form hydrogen bonds. But before doing that, we're just going to go over hydrogen bonds really quickly. So hydrogen bonds, they are weak intermolecular forces. And what intermolecular means is that it occurs between two different molecules. It does not occur inside of a molecule. And hydrogen bonds occur when a hydrogen is covalently bonded to a highly electronegative atom, which interacts with another electronegative atom. So in other words, hydrogen bonds form between two separate molecules when the atoms involved are highly electronegative. And hydrogen bonds arise because the molecules have opposite partial charges. So a partial positive charge on a hydrogen atom and a partial negative charge on another electronegative atom in a neighboring molecule is what causes hydrogen bonds to form. So when we apply this concept to water, we see that our water has its polar covalent bonds occurring intramolecularly, and we see that our oxygens have a partial negative charge and our hydrogens have a partial positive charge. And the hydrogen having a partial positive charge is what makes it attracted to this other water molecule's partially negative oxygen atom. And this is important to our hydrogen bonds because our partial charges on the hydrogen atoms of one water molecule is attracted to the partial negative charge on the oxygen of another water molecule, which is an intermolecular attraction. And it's important to know that each water molecule can form up to 4 hydrogen bonds. And they do this by having 2 bonds from its hydrogen atoms. So we could have one here, another one here, and then we have 2 forming from its oxygen atoms lone pairs, here and right here. And it's also important to know that water molecules are constantly forming and breaking and reforming, and this is what makes water so dynamic. These hydrogen bonds that hold it together, they're always separating and always coming back together. And this constant forming and breaking of bonds is what gives water its extremely important properties that allow life to continue. So the next section of this chapter is titled 4 Emergent Properties of Water Contribute to Earth's Suitability for Life. And these are the 4 special properties that make life possible on Earth. So let's just break them down. The first property we have is organisms depend on the cohesion of water molecules. So one way that we can think about cohesion is by saying that cohesion is water sticking to itself, so water droplets combining, and cohesion happens because of hydrogen bonds. And the exact definition of cohesion is just the phenomenon by which hydrogen bonds hold these water molecules together. So cohesion is actually the reason that water can move up a plant from its roots to its leaves. It is the way of nutrient transport in our plants. And this is important because our plants obtain this energy, they obtain these nutrients, and then plant-eating animals come in and eat them and obtain the nutrients and energy that the plant just created. And cohesion is also the reason that water is able to climb up a paper towel when we dip it in. And the way that water is able to stick to substances or materials that aren't water is by adhesion. So adhesion is the interaction of water molecules to other things. Like in this cup, we have adhesion occurring between this water and the edge of this glass cup. And then we have cohesion occurring between the water molecules, which is what we see here. And water has this really important characteristic, which is surface tension. And surface tension is the result of cohesion and is actually defined as the amount of force necessary to stretch or break a liquid's surface, which is what we see here. This downward force upon water is what defines surface tension. How much force coming this way do we need in order to break these bonds holding the water together? So, water does have a high surface tension, and that's actually what allows certain organisms to walk on it. And it's also the reason that we can overfill a cup and see a dome form on top of it, but not have water spill out. So, the next property that we're going to talk about is the ability of water to moderate Earth's temperature. And the ability that water has to regulate the temperature is so important to sustaining life. But to understand this, we need to go over some foundational concepts. So, kinetic energy is defined as the energy of motions, and all molecules and atoms have kinetic energy because they are always moving. And thermal energy is just defined as the total kinetic energy of all of the molecules in a substance. So we can think of it kind of like a body of water, like a pool or a lake. When we get in or we touch it, we might feel that the water is cold to us. But the energy, the thermal energy of the body of water is huge because of the amount of water molecules that are in it and are constantly moving. So even though it's cold to us, all of those molecules and atoms are moving so much that the amount of thermal energy that we have in it is really high. And another important concept to understand is temperature. And temperature is just the measure of the average kinetic energy of all of the molecules and atoms. And the difference between temperature and thermal energy is that thermal energy is the sum total of all the energy, of all of the kinetic energy of the molecules. Meanwhile, temperature is only measuring the average kinetic energy. So, thermal energy is equal to the sum total of all kinetic energy. Meanwhile, temperature is equal to the average kinetic energy of molecules. So we can kind of think of it like this. So if we want to imagine that we are in a park, in the park, the thermal energy is going to be all of the energy between the children and all of the people that are moving around. And the temperature would just be the average speed of every single person moving. So just like our atoms and molecules, they will all move at different speeds. Everybody is going to move differently. And when we take together the sum of all of the energy in the park, we get our thermal energy. Meanwhile, temperature is going to be the average energy of everybody's movement. So the next term that we need to understand is heat. And heat is just the transfer of thermal energy from one substance to another. So, for example, we have two different substances. And let's just say that this one is at 20 degrees Celsius and this one is at 50 degrees Celsius. What happens is that heat is going to move from hot to cold. So if we want to think about it kind of like water and ice, when we pour ice into water, the water is going to start to cool down. And this happens because heat in the water is flowing to the ice, which melts it. Hot always moves to cold. So essentially, when two objects of different temperatures are brought together, thermal energy passes and it goes from the warmer object to the cooler object until the two objects are at equilibrium, until they are at the same temperature. And the molecules in the cooler object are going to start to move faster because of the thermal energy that is being transported from the warmer object. So ice cools a drink not by adding coldness to the drink, but instead it cools it by absorbing the thermal energy of the water, which causes the ice's molecules to move faster and heat up. So when we think about it, water is able to moderate Earth's temperature by absorbing the heat from warmer air. And this absorption is going to increase the water's kinetic energy, and it's going to break hydrogen bonds, which is going to allow it to store heat. So as the water cools, these hydrogen bonds between our water molecules are going to reform and then release heat into the cooler air, which stabilizes the Earth's temperature. And it is important to know that all substances do not respond to heat in the same way. Some materials heat up or cool down quickly, meanwhile others resist temperature. And this concept is going to bring us to the idea of specific heat. And specific heat just refers to how much energy is required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of a substance by 1 degree Celsius. And the unit that we use to measure heat is known as a calorie. And basically, calories are just measuring the amount of heat that is needed to raise the temperature of water by 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And we see calories a lot on our food labels, and we generally associate them with high caloric intake equals we get fat, which is true, but calories are actually just a measure of how much heat energy that food that you're about to consume can provide to your body during metabolism. So because water has a high specific heat, it serves as a standard for defining the calorie as a measurement. And every time that we have a calorie released, it means that 1 gram of water is cooled by 1 degree Celsius. And water having this high specific heat is important because it allows water to act like a thermal buffer, which maintains the stable conditions which are necessary for life. And water does have a high specific heat because of hydrogen bonding. So the hydrogen bonds create a network of connected water molecules, all which require energy to break or disrupt. So when heat is applied to water, the energy is first used to break the hydrogen bonds instead of increasing the water's kinetic energy. And that is because of that, the temperature of water is able to rise more slowly in comparison to other substances that do not have hydrogen bonds. And this same concept also applies to water cooling. So when water cools, our hydrogen bonds start to reform and release heat in the process. And that is actually what prevents our water from cooling rapidly. So overall, our water's high specific heat allows it to resist drastic temperature changes, which stabilizes our climate and protects our organisms from thermal fluctuations. And the hydrogen bonds in water act like a buffer, which help to maintain a consistent internal temperature for living organisms, which is essential for processes like enzyme function and cellular activity. So for the same reason that water has high specific heat, it also has a high heat of vaporization. And vaporization or evaporation, the two words are synonymous, is the process by which a liquid turns into a gas. And this occurs when molecular movement increases to the point in which molecules move so fast that they can break free from the attractions of other molecules in the liquid. So we can think of it like this. We can think of it kind of like the speed of molecular movement in a liquid is not uniform. Some molecules move faster and others move slower, and the temperature represents the average kinetic energy of these molecules. So the average speed of all of these molecules moving is temperature. And even when we are at a low temperature, we have a few molecules that move fast enough to escape as a gas. But when you heat a liquid, we are increasing the average kinetic energy, which makes evaporation happen faster. But even in a hot liquid, we have some molecules that are moving slower than the rest. So basically, heat of vaporization is defined as the quantity of heat that a liquid must absorb for 1 gram of it to be converted from a liquid to a gas. And water has such a high heat of vaporization because of its hydrogen bonds. Breaking its hydrogen bonds requires a lot of energy, just like we saw with the water's high specific heat. And another important concept is evaporative cooling. And when water evaporates, the surface left behind cools down. And this happens because the molecules with the highest kinetic energy, which are the hotter ones, are able to first escape, and they escape as a gas. So the water molecules that are left behind have lower kinetic energy, which results in a lower temperature of the liquid. And an important example of evaporative cooling is sweat. So when we sweat, our fast-moving water molecules evaporate from our skin and leave behind the cooler molecules, which cools down our skin and helps us regulate our core body temperature. So if we did not sweat, if we did not have evaporative cooling in this way, we would overheat and we would die quite easily, especially in hot places. So the next emergent property of water is that ice floats on water. And water is one of the few substances on Earth that is less dense as a solid as a liquid. And that is actually why ice floats. So what happens is that when water freezes, our hydrogen bonds lock the waters into a sort of crystalline structure, and it spaces them further apart compared to when they were in a liquid form. And this expansion is what makes ice less dense. And this is so important to us because if ice sank, all bodies of water would freeze solid from the bottom up, making them inhospitable for aquatic life. So the ability of ice to float just forms an insulative layer on the surface of water, which protects the water beneath it from freezing, which is what allows aquatic life to continue during the cold months. So the last property of water that we're going to be going over is that water is a solvent of life. And water is referred to as a universal solvent of life because it has the ability to dissolve more substances than any other liquid. So a solution is just a homogeneous mixture of 2 or more substances, and the solvent is what dissolves the solute. For example, when we look down here, we have a solution, which is salt water, and we got this solution because we had salt, which is our solute, which was poured into water and dissolved in water, which is our solvent. And once our solute dissolves into our solvent, we obtain our solution, which is salt water. And water's versatility as a solvent comes from its polar nature and hydrogen bonding. Its molecular shape is what allows it to interact and dissolve with a variety of substances. And this is important because most chemical reactions in organisms occur in aqueous solutions, occur in watery solutions. So the ability of water to interact with a wide variety of substances plays a key role in many biological processes. So substances that dissolve well in water are known as hydrophilic. They are water-loving. And examples of hydrophilic molecules include ionic compounds, like salts, and other polar molecules like sugars. And water's polarity is what allows it to form hydrogen bonds and dissolve these substances. But on the other hand, we have nonpolar substances such as oils and fats, and they are hydrophobic. They are water-fearing. They do not interact well with water. They repel water and have a tendency to clump together. And this is really important in processes like cell membrane formation. So to understand chemical reactions in aqueous solutions, we have to be able to measure the mass of the dissolved molecules. And molecular mass is the sum of all of the atomic masses of a molecule's atoms. And instead of counting individual molecules, which are extremely small, we use a unit that is called the mole. And 1 mole is equal to 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd particles. And this is a constant that is known as Avogadro's number. And you guys do need to know this constant. So we can think of a mole in the same way that we think of other relationships. And basically, the same way that a dozen equals 12, 1 mole is equal to 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd particles. So 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd particles is equal to 1 mole. And the mole is the standard unit that lets us relate molecular masses to the quantities used in experiments or reactions. So understanding this unit of measurement is really important in order for us to measure the molecules that we have within a substance, a liquid substance. So the third and final section of this chapter is that acidic and basic conditions affect living organisms. So sometimes when we have a hydrogen atom that is participating in a hydrogen bond between two molecules, it is going to shift from one molecule to another. And when this happens, a hydrogen atom leaves its electrons behind, and it is transferred as a hydrogen ion, which is a single proton with a positive charge. And the water molecule that lost this proton is now a hydroxide ion and has a negative charge. So what happens is that we have a water molecule. It dissociates during this time into a hydroxide ion and a hydrogen ion. And now we just have a free-floating hydrogen ion, which is going to move over to another water molecule. And when we add our hydrogen ion to our water molecule, we're left with something called a hydronium ion, which has a positive charge. And that's because now there's more protons than electrons. And while this dissociation of water is rare, it is reversible, but it is crucial to the chemistry of life because these ions, they are highly reactive and they affect many biological processes. So in pure water, our concentration of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions is actually equal. And what that means is that because these ions are very reactive, they are able to disrupt proteins and other complex molecules. And they do this by altering their structure and function when certain kinds of solutes are added. So even a small change in their concentrations is able to significantly affect reactions in living organisms. And that's why having an equal concentration of these hydrogen and hydroxide ions is so important. And basically, an acid is a substance that increases the hydrogen ion concentration within a solution. So, for example, when we have hydrochloric acid that is added to water, it is going to dissociate into hydrogen ions and chloride ions. And this increase of hydrogen ions in the solution is going to produce an acidic environment. So basically, hydrochloric acid is able to disrupt the natural balance of hydroxide and hydrogen ions in water by introducing more hydrogen ions, which is going to lower the pH of the solution. And on the other hand, we have a base. And a base is a substance that reduces the hydrogen ion concentration in a solution. So for example, when we have sodium hydroxide, it is going to dissociate into sodium and hydroxide ions. And the dissociation of this sodium hydroxide is going to cause these hydroxide ions to bind to hydrogen ions, which is going to reduce the concentration of hydrogen ions and make the solution more basic. It is going to raise the pH of a solution. So the pH here goes up, and the pH here goes down. And the pH scale just measures the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. And because there is not always an equal concentration of hydrogen and hydroxide ions in solutions, their concentration can vary greatly. And that's why scientists developed a way to express this variation of our hydrogen and hydroxide ions, and they named it the pH scale. So basically, the pH scale just measures the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution in aqueous solutions, and it ranges from 0 to 14. And pH is a logarithmic scale, and what that means is that each whole number change corresponds to a 10-fold change in hydrogen ion concentration. So for example, when we have a pH of 3, it is not 2 times more acidic than a pH of 6. We have to jump from a pH of 3 to 4, which is 10, 10 to 5, which is 100, and 5 to 6, which is 1,000. So a difference between a pH of 3 and 6 is that a pH is 1,000 times more acidic than a pH of 6. So in a pure water solution at 25 degrees Celsius, there is an equal concentration of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. And the molarity of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions are both 10 to the negative 7. And anytime we have something enclosed in brackets, we are just talking about the molarity of that molecule. So when we put together our hydrogen ions and our hydroxide ions, we have a total concentration of 10 to the negative 14. So when we have a pH of 7, it is considered neutral. And what that means is that there is an equal number of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. But a pH that is greater than 7 is considered basic, and it has a lower concentration of hydrogen ions than hydroxide ions. So basically, the pH scale is a compression of the variance of the relationship that we see between hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. And most of our biological fluids have a pH between 6 to 8. And the pH of blood is found between 7.35 and 7.45. And if our blood pH changes and it is not corrected, within minutes, it can be fatal. And this is because our cells cannot function outside of that range. And if there is a deviation of this pH, our proteins are going to denature. Our enzymes are going to fail. We're going to have impaired oxygen delivery. We're going to have we're going to have cellular dysfunction, and so on. So Now that we know how important maintaining an appropriate pH is, there's no question about why it is that organisms have to be so sensitive to changes in pH. So, most cells operate with an internal pH that is close to neutral, that is about 7. And a slight deviation of this pH can lead to severe problems because the chemical reactions that are necessary for life depend on the stability of the pH environment. And this sensitivity is why organisms rely on buffer systems to minimize pH fluctuations. And buffers act as chemical safeguards. They maintain the stability in biological fluids, and they just ensure that life's processes can continue uninterrupted. And buffers are defined as substances that minimize changes in the concentration of our hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions in a solution. And they work by accepting hydrogen ions when they have too much and by donating hydrogen ions when they don't have enough. So, buffers, they typically consist of a weak acid and its base. And these things, they interact reversibly with hydrogen ions. So if a strong acid is added, the weak base is going to neutralize it. And if a strong base is added, the weak acid is going to neutralize that. So this system is what's going to maintain our pH. And a common buffer that we see in human blood is the bicarbonate buffer system. And what happens is that if our blood pH drops, our bicarbonate ions are going to bind with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, which is going to reduce the acidity of our blood. But if our pH rises, carbonic acid is going to dissociate and it's going to release hydrogen ions, which is going to increase the acidity of our blood. So overall, we need buffers in order to maintain a stable environment and continue life.